I am Dan Reiter, chair of the Political Science Department at Emory, and I'm very pleased that Rosalie has asked me to come speak with you tonight. And I'm extremely pleased and impressed that so many have come out to think about, read about, and discuss this tremendously important issue. Regardless of your position on the issue, I think we all understand that what we are to do with Iraq is America's most pressing issue. I've been asked to talk about the endgame in Iraq, what you might call our exit strategy. How shall we exit Iraq? I believe that many of you have read this Great Decisions reading by Anthony Cordesman. He does a nice job of laying out some important pieces of the puzzle, some facts about Iraq, some military realities, and other important issues to think about. Perhaps to make this even more interesting and compelling is that the variety of options we have before us is represented by the array of presidential candidates we have before us on the television every evening. Some on the campaign trail, like presidential candidate Ron Paul, declares that we should pull out all troops essentially immediately. Some, like candidates John McCain and Mitt Romney, favor a more open-ended commitment. And others, like John Edwards, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama, lie somewhere between these two extremes with various soft timetables for withdrawal. So how you come down on the Iraq issue is probably going to be closely related to the ballot you cast either in the Georgia caucus as well as the election we'll have this November. Tonight, I'm going to speak for 35 or 40 minutes or so about a few issues relating to this key question of our exit strategy in Iraq. What should the end game be? And my hope is to build on some of the issues laid out in the Cordesman reading, to talk about some contemporary developments, and hopefully to give you some things to think about. I wish I had some easy answers, but to tip my hand, I'm afraid I don't. So hopefully I'll still give you some things to think about. Okay, so the first big question to think about is, what is an exit strategy? You know, what is an endgame? What does it mean to think about how we're going to get out of Iraq? And one way to think about it is that an exit strategy is basically an answer to the question, when do we declare victory and go home? Now, America has had different answers to this question in different wars over time. In World War II, our exit strategy was relatively simple. We pursued and eventually achieved the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. In the Korean War, our exit strategy changed. In summer of 1950 and autumn of 1950, we sought to conquer North Korea and overthrow the communist government there. And we eventually shifted towards an exit strategy of restoring the pre-war territorial borders. Now, in the 1960s and early 1970s, America, of course, fought the Vietnam War. And a prominent critique of American policy in Vietnam was that there was no exit strategy. There were no criteria for how America could declare victory and go home. There were no definite mileposts for understanding when we had succeeded, when we had sufficiently stopped communist infiltration of South Vietnam, and when we could know for sure that non-communist South Vietnam would be able to stand on its own 2 feet. In the early 1990s, we fought the first Gulf War, and our policy there was very clearly a response to the Vietnam War, where General Powell and President Bush, the elder Bush, very clearly thought about what our exit strategy was going to be in Iraq, against Iraq. And there it was very clearly the liberation of Kuwait, full stop. Once we'd liberated Kuwait, then we could declare victory and go home, and we did. Okay, now that brings us up to the 2003 Iraq War. Now, initially, the goal of the George W. Bush administration was, of course, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein's government. Saddam Hussein was seen as the center of the Iraqi problem, that he supported the Iraqi pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, that he supported the terrorist groups around the world, including Al-Qaeda, and that American foreign policy goals would be accomplished once he was thrown from power. Now, the good news was, of course, that we were able to depose Saddam Hussein from power relatively quickly in the first phase of that war, which lasted only a few short weeks. And the Bush administration assumed that democracy, stability, and economic prosperity would very easily follow. Now that seems like a hopelessly optimistic perspective, but remember that at the time, perhaps it didn't seem so terribly outlandish. Iraq is and was a relatively well-educated, urbanized country, and those are thought to be, good foundations for democracy. It was thought that most of the country hated Saddam Hussein and welcomed the opportunity to throw him from power. And also was thought that Iraq's vast oil wealth would make the reconstruction of Iraq relatively easy. All we would have to do is to reconstitute the Iraqi oil industry, and Iraq's oil revenues would pay for its own reconstruction. Now, of course, these goals have not been accomplished, and in hindsight, it seems that it was a fool's errand. Now, today, people disagree about whether or not the decision to invade was the right decision. People debate over what were the key mistakes. People debate over whether the war could have been fought better. Those of us who are Monday morning quarterbacks say, well, this could have worked if only we had not disbanded the military, if only, Bremer had not made these mistakes, it could have worked. Well, these are all, fine questions for academics like myself who like to occupy ourselves with footnotes and history and so forth. But for real people, like everyone in the audience, and most of America, the real question is, well, what shall we do now? Whether or not, we should have gotten into this mess or not, we all must clean it up and decide what to do. And to return to our central theme tonight, when can we declare victory and go home? Okay, to set the table for this discussion a bit further, let me undergo the unfortunate task of presenting you with some unavoidable realities, which everyone must face regardless of your thoughts on the issue. The first unavoidable reality is that America will one day have to bring at least most of its troops home. Today, there are about 160,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, 30,000 of which are the so-called surge. General Petraeus has said those 30,000 will come home this July. And everyone, even the most hawkish of hawks, knows that our troops will not be there indefinitely. In 10 years, they will not be there, or at least most of them will not be there. So the question is not whether we should withdraw from Iraq, but rather when. A second unavoidable reality is that a substantial escalation of the current U.S. forces, even for a short time period, is essentially out of the question. Even if you sort of dismiss the political problems with the substantial escalation, the American military is now straining just to maintain those 160,000 troops. And absent the return of a draft, which is completely off the table politically and within the halls of the Pentagon, there's no way we would be able to escalate to 200,000 or 300,000 troops. Also out of the question is the possibility that any other country can fill the gap for us and send substantial forces to help sustain Iraq over the long term. The Bush administration's closest ally in this venture is Great Britain, and there has been, of course, a substantial drawdown in British forces in Iraq, and they are certainly not eager to return in any great numbers. A couple more realities that we have to face. One is that we will have to deal with Iran and Syria as part of our grand solution. They are not going anywhere. They remain bordered with Iraq, and they will have enduring political interests. The more bad news about Iran is they seem to be increasingly restive. There was this recent naval incident in the Persian Gulf in which a number of small Iranian vessels threatened to charge some American vessels. And reports indicate that there has been an uptick in the number of Iranian-based explosives now appearing in the Iraqi insurgency. Syria also is not going anywhere. And then a last sort of unavoidable reality is that there are no easy political solutions to domestic Iraqi problems. Now, as many of you probably saw in the paper over the last week or so, there was an important step forward as the Iraqi government agreed to let former members of Saddam's political party, the Ba'ath Party, back into government. And this is seen as a step towards bringing Sunni Arabs back into the political process, reducing their alienation, and hopefully taking steps forward towards building a grand coalition of Sunnis, Shia, and Kurds to build a united Iraq. A caveat I must suggest is that there are many doubters of this law. It's unclear whether it will work. The Sunnis are suspicious of this law. The law does not allow them to take positions at key government ministries like Defense, Justice, Interior, Finance, and the Foreign Ministry. And additionally, even if this problem gets solved, there are other critical issues remaining. Iraq has a vast oil wealth, but it is unevenly distributed. It is mostly located where the Kurds live in the north of Iraq and where the Shia live in the south of Iraq. And it must be distributed to all of Iraq, all the major ethnic groups, in an agreeable fashion. That has to be solved. There has to be the creation of a stable federal structure which is accepted by all groups. What we're facing in Iraq now, one might think, is something like America in 1860, where you have sections of the country geographically separated, which are deeply antipathetic to each other and have deep, deep differences over important policy questions. And the question is, can a political solution be crafted which will allow the two factions to live in at least acceptable harmony, or will they be plunged into some civil conflict, as, of course, the United States faced in the years after 1860? Okay, so that's the bad news. That's a number of unfortunate realities we must face. And so from knowing those realities, accepting those realities, how should we leave? What should our exit strategy be? Now, one way to think about this is to ask yourself, what do I want Iraq to look like when we leave? How much do I want of Iraq? How much progress do I want Iraq to make? Now, the least demanding standard would be, I don't care what Iraq looks like as long as Saddam Hussein is not the leader. There can be genocide, there can be civil war. I don't care as long as Saddam Hussein is out of power. And of course, with that very low criterion, that would allow an exit strategy almost immediately. Now, a slightly more demanding standard would be something like the following, that and when I say I mean all of you, because this is a very personal decision, of course. You have to decide what you want. I can't tell you what to do. But you might say, I'll be satisfied when Iraq looks something like Pakistan. Okay? And by that, I mean a politically unstable country with an illegitimate, perhaps autocratic leader, which has many unresolved problems, but it's at least short of civil war and genocide. Okay? Now, the next most demanding standard you might have is you might say, well, I'm going to be happy with Iraq. I'll be ready to leave when Iraq looks like Lebanon. Okay? That is a country with emerging democratic institutions, although certainly some internal instability, not substantial violence, and some factions, but at least the hope of forging long-term peace. And the most demanding standard is that you say, I'll be ready to leave when Iraq looks like Norway. Okay? It's highly democratic. It's highly stable. It's a solid U.S. ally. And they have a prosperous economy fueled by oil. Now, you're all chuckling, but really that's the standard, if you think about it, that the Bush administration hoped would happen in short order in early 2003, that all these criteria would be met. Now, right now, I think most people would say that Iraq is somewhere short of Pakistan. Okay? And I think it's probably fair to say that most people who want to stay the course, most political leaders, want to stay the course until Iraq gets to the point of looking like Lebanon. That's how long they want to stay. Okay, now to briefly summarize the debate, the people who want to stay longer think that U.S. forces are helping to stabilize Iraq and that more stabilization is needed. That's on one side. And on the other side, people who want to withdraw our forces sooner think that U.S. forces may be making things worse in Iraq, and that regardless, the escalating costs of the U.S. troop presence are unacceptable. Okay, so that's a real thumbnail sketch of the two sides. Now, let me take a few minutes and break down the sort of assumptions of these two positions and the arguments that the two sides make. Okay, now one argument for staying longer is you could say, well, in the last 6 months or so, in the context of the surge in U.S. forces, as America has increased its troop presence by about 30,000 troops, violence has gone down significantly in Iraq since around June of 2007. General David Petraeus reported last month that violent attacks in Iraq had fallen some 60% since June, and they were down to the rates of violence that we had seen back in mid-2005. And General Petraeus attributes the decline in violence to the increased number of troops, to some changes in American military strategy, and so on and so forth. So on this side, someone might say, well, we finally figured out what we need to do to reduce violence in Iraq. We finally, there's some hope. Up until the surge, it looked like we had no idea about how to clamp down on the insurgency. And it looks like we finally understand how to use U.S. forces positively, so let's keep going, let's stick it out, and continue to make positive progress. That's, I think, what an advocate of staying longer might say in the context of the last 6 months in the surge. Now, that being said, there are some reasons for tempering this optimism. Though the latter half of 2007 was more peaceful, the first half of 2007 was extremely violent. Another reason for tempering our optimism, as I said earlier, is if it is because of the surge in U.S. troops, that surge is temporary. And General Petraeus has said that those troops will be removed in July, and it's unlikely that that those 30,000 troops could stay much longer. Some other points. The gains that have been made, even in the last 6 months, have been limited in scope. Violence remains relatively undiminished in northern Iraq and the Kurdish regions. And General Petraeus himself characterizes these recent gains as temporary and fragile. Further, one very depressing lesson we've learned over the last 4 years is that the insurgency has proven itself to be very clever and adept at adapting. I heard one military officer put it this way in sort of combating the insurgency. He said, combating the insurgency is like a big cat and mouse game, but we're dealing with a very, very smart mouse. And one way that this is seen is a lot of reports in the media are about mines, so-called IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And there's a real back and forth as A new IED is developed. American military forces figure out a way to defeat it, and then the insurgency comes up with a new IED, a technology or approach. And then kind of a couple last points about tempering optimism. Although there has been an improved security situation, there has not been substantial progress in other areas. I talked about important political goals still to be met. On the economic side, things are still very shaky. Electricity provision is about the same level as it was in 2006 and 2007. Only about 50% of Iraq's electrical needs are being met. Unemployment is still very high. And a last point is, I'm afraid that we need to be careful about how we take official data. We learned in Vietnam that sometimes government spokespeople, play with the numbers. So was it George Bush said fuzzy math in 2000? In Vietnam, there are all these great claims about body counts. Great numbers of North Vietnamese that we were killing. But it turns out that those body count numbers were being inflated by military commanders who wanted to meet their quotas. There's some evidence that this is happening in Iraq. For example, there's a new government report that the Iraqi ministries are vastly overstating how much they have spent on capital projects, building roads and so forth. In mid-2007, they claimed they spent about 24% of their capital projects budget, but they only spent about 4% in reality. Okay, so that's one side. That's kind of, the pluses and minuses, advocating for staying longer. On the other side, there are those who advocate we should pull out more quickly. And they say that U.S. forces might be making matters even worse. The argument is that U.S. forces in Iraq fuel rage and anti-Americanism and stoke the insurgency. Some think that the presence of U.S. forces is discouraging Iraqis from taking the difficult steps necessary to implement political reforms, to establish a multi-ethnic coalition, and that a U.S. withdrawal would force Iraqi politicians to make tough decisions and come together. Some point to the Iraqi city of Basra as an example of this dynamic. In 2007, British troops withdrew from Basra, and some claim there has been a reduction in violence there, in part because Iraqi politicians and forces have had to fill the vacuum and provide stability themselves. So this claim is contested. Okay, so that's kind of one central argument of the critics of staying longer. Now, the big problem with this view is that you don't know if withdrawal is going to work until you've committed to withdrawal. Right? Once we start to pull U.S. forces out, it's only then we're going to know whether it's worked or not. And by that point, we will not be able to send them back in, especially if things get even worse. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that the downside of withdrawal could be very down. It could be very bad. I mean, at the limits, there could be civil war in Iraq. There could be genocide. There could be widespread Iranian intervention in Iraqi politics. There could be the creation of an al-Qaeda mini-state within Iraq. So withdrawal could be quite dangerous. Okay, now that's another big argument that critics make, or that critics of the Bush administration make, is that aside from the question of are American troops making things better or worse, the war effort in Iraq is just unacceptably costly. Now, this is an issue which is not discussed too much by courtismen in the reading, but it's something that we have to think about. Because war, it's a policy tool. I mean, I know we think about war as being so awful and so forth, and it is, but at another level, it's simply a tool we have for accomplishing American goals. And like any other policy tool, like economic aid, or alliances, or trade, or anything else, or diplomacy, you have to think about costs as well as benefits. Okay? Now, some people will say, well, we have to spend whatever it takes to succeed in Iraq. But people don't really believe that. I mean, no one in America thinks we would be willing to accept 600,000 American deaths in order to accomplish victory in Iraq, which is about the number of deaths we suffered in the Civil War. No one thinks it's worth spending that much. So then the question we all have to ask ourselves is, what is an acceptable level of costs? How much blood and money and other costs are we willing to spend in order to accomplish our goals in Iraq? Okay, now I certainly cannot tell you what the level of acceptable costs should be. That's an individual decision. But let me lay out 4 main costs of the war that we have to think about when we think about how long we should stay. Now, the first cost of the war are diplomatic costs. The American presence in Iraq is increasing anti-Americanism worldwide. Now, the Bush administration, or President Bush, has said foreign policy is not a popularity contest. We do what's right for America. We don't do something just because we want, for other people to like us. Now, on the one hand, I certainly agree with President Bush. We have to do what's best for America. But however, there are very real consequences to anti-Americanism. Specifically, anti-Americanism undermines the war on terror, and it undermines the U.S. ability to lead on other important issues like global warming and the Middle East peace. Now, in the last several weeks, Americans have been much more focused on Pakistan following the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, recognizing there's a substantial fundamentalist Muslim faction within Pakistan, and Pakistan has nuclear weapons. However, anti-Americanism is at extremely high levels in Pakistan. A September 2007 poll in Pakistan found that 86% of Pakistanis think that it is definitely or probably a U.S. goal to weaken and divide the Muslim world. And that's up 13 percentage points from earlier in the year. Okay. Now, the level of anti-Americanism in Pakistan is quite important. The highly unpopular pro-American Pakistani dictator Pervez Musharraf is likely going to fall from power soon, and we certainly would not want him to be replaced by someone who was virulently anti-American. Okay. Now, a second major cost to the war is the erosion of the U.S. military. Now, as everyone knows, the American military is based on a volunteer system. It's not a draft. So people join the military simply because they want to. Now, the problem is that the Iraq War has undermined American military recruitment, undermining U.S. military strength. Specifically, American military recruiters have had to substantially lower the standards in order to meet their quotas. So we are taking more and more young men and women with lower intellectual capabilities, lower educational records, and sometimes people with criminal records. And the continuance of this war in Iraq is probably going to continue to jeopardize our ability to recruit. Further, operations in Iraq directly undermine our ability to fight the war in Afghanistan. And we certainly need to win in Afghanistan at least as much as we need to win in Iraq, because of that, of course, is the home of the Taliban. Okay, a third major cost is financial cost. Now, the war is costing us about $100 billion per year. Now, that is money which we could spend on lots of other things. Now, I'm going to assume that in the audience there's an array of political viewpoints represented. Now, if you are a conservative, that is $100 billion worth of tax cuts, about $300 per year per American citizen. If you are a fiscal hawk, that is someone who hates deficits more than anything, then $100 billion a year, that's about a third of the projected 2008 federal budget deficit, right, which is about $250 billion. If you are a liberal, then that's $100 billion worth of social programs. Health care for children, retraining people who've lost their jobs because of globalization, more police on the streets, more money for alternative energy, pick your program. Now, some of you might say, well, this is war, and we can't, we have to spend on national security, we have to make sacrifices, we just have to spend that $100 billion a year on Iraq because we have to protect America. So we just can't subsidize wind farms, and we can't do these we can't cut the deficit. We just have to bite the bullet and spend the money. However, I would argue to you that that $100 billion might be much more efficiently spent on national security. Even if you think national security is the highest priority, we could spend that money better. For example, there was a recent government report which found that financial shortfalls were undermining the ability of Customs, Border, and Patrol officers to implement anti-terrorism programs in monitoring individuals attempting to cross the border. And certainly one of the most important things that we can do in the war on terror is keeping known terrorism suspects out of the country. As I mentioned, Afghanistan is far from being secured. We could spend that money on the Afghanistan campaign. There are a whole array of anti-terrorism initiatives you could spend on. There's a lot of nuclear materials around the world which can be used to build nuclear weapons. We can spend more money on securing that materials in Russia and elsewhere so that terrorists can't get them. We can improve port security. Now, many of you may be thinking, well, port security, who cares? Who cares about port security? Why is that relevant to terrorism? Well, it turns out that if you wanted to engage in an act of nuclear terrorism against America, the easiest thing to do would be to take a nuclear weapon in some other country, stick it in a shipping container, put it in a boat, sail it into any major harbor, Los Angeles, San Diego, New York, and detonate it. And the only way to solve that problem is better port security, and that is an initiative which costs billions of dollars because it requires higher levels of port security at American ports and as well as foreign ports. Okay. So we've talked about diplomatic costs, we talked about military costs, we talked about financial costs. The last cost I want to talk about is human costs. We've so far lost about 3,900 American dead from the war. We've lost about 28,000 wounded. People who've lost limbs, major head injuries and so forth. About 1 in 6 returning veterans suffer from severe psychological problems like depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. There was a report recently identifying 121 murders committed in America by Iraq vets because of post-traumatic stress disorder. Lots of other smaller problems. Divorce and alcoholism rates among returning vets are higher. And this is aside from an estimated 150,000 Iraqi dead from violence from 2003 to about 2006. Now, I was trying to think about, how to talk about human costs to all of you. And one way I thought about it is, if you think about your lives and your families, think about all the worst things that happen to you or to the people that you love. Death. Dealing with a friend or a loved one who suffers from a severe mental disorder like depression. A severe physical disability, like being in a wheelchair. Divorce. Drug and alcohol dependency. All of these things, which I know that all of us either experience personally or that we know someone close to us who's experiencing it, the war is inflicting all of those traumas on tens of thousands of Americans, and so is substantially disrupting tens of thousands of American families. And that's something which we have to think about. Is that a price that we want to pay or not? And how much of it do we want to pay? Okay, I'm going to wrap up, and then we'll open it for questions. Now, let me just, again, remind you that this issue is something that all of you as American citizens must weigh in on. And you cannot, I would urge you not to defer to experts like me to tell you what to do, for two reasons. One is that experts like me are often wrong. Remember that, before the Iraq War, all the experts said that Iraq had nuclear weapons. Well, that turned out to be dead wrong. Up until late November, all the experts said that Iran was getting nuclear weapons. Well, then they had a report which came out which said that Iran abandoned its nuclear weapons program as of 2003. So one reason is experts like me were often wrong. Emperor has no clothes. I freely admit it. A second big point is that making decisions about Iraq is fundamentally about values. It's about your values. It's something that you have to decide. Only you can answer the critical questions of, what do you want Iraq to look like? Do you want it to look like Pakistan? Do you want it to look like Lebanon or Norway? And how much blood and money are you willing to spend in order to buy a certain increased percentage chance of a somewhat better outcome in Iraq? To put it very bluntly, how much money are you willing to spend, and how many lives are you willing to spend in order to try to get Iraq to look more like Lebanon and less like Pakistan? And that's not a question I can answer for you. That's a question that all of you have to answer for yourselves. I'll stop there and turn it over for questions. The question was, if we withdraw totally from Iraq, what lies ahead for our country, for America? Is that your question? For our country. Well, no one has an answer to that question. And we can only make best guesses, just as we can only make best guesses as to what will happen if we stay the course. So the very difficult decision we have to make is we have to think about best guesses and probabilities. We have to think about what is the probability of civil war and genocide in Iraq if we withdraw, and exactly when do we withdraw? If we stay, what is the probability that staying an extra year, say, or 2 years, will reduce the likelihood of civil war and genocide by 30%? I don't have any answers to those questions. I can't pretend to, and I don't think anyone does. The only thing that I would urge everyone to think about is that there are costs to whatever you do. And even if one feels uncomfortable, like perhaps this woman feels uncomfortable with withdrawing immediately, which is a perfectly reasonable, reaction, don't get me wrong, to not withdraw has costs. And we have to think about, are we willing to pay those costs? And how much of those costs are we willing to pay? Right, the question is, how do we get the troops out? And I actually think there are two questions here, and let me see if I can get at both of them. I mean, one question is sort of just logistically, how do we get them out? The infrastructure is poor. And I actually thought that the Cordesman reading had a very nice discussion of this very issue of, with the logistics of getting them out. And he made the point that, you cannot wave a magic wand and, distribute 130,000 air tickets and everyone leaves over the weekend. It takes a long time. You have to get the hardware out, the tanks and the large equipment out. It takes a long time. And so that's one reason why the presidential candidates and the Bush administration are thinking about this into the future, 2 to 3 years in the future. If you want to draw down to, say, 50,000 troops by the end of 2010, say, it takes you have to plan very far ahead. The other question, which I think you're getting at, is, are there dangers to telegraphing when we're going to leave? Are there dangers of saying to Al-Qaeda and our foes, we're all going to be gone in 2010? And so the concern is, well, if an insurgent knows that, then the smart thing to do is just to sort of sit back and wait until 2010, and then when all American troops have left, then to swarm through the country. That's certainly a concern. However, what I would, urge you to think about is American withdrawal is inevitable. And because it takes so long, we will never be able to have a surprise withdrawal. We'll never be able to say, on Friday, we're staying for the course, and on Monday, everyone's going to be gone. So at some point, we're going to have to say, we're drawing down our forces. So we're going to have to face this problem regardless. And even more worrisome is if the borders with Syria and Iran are not secured, then no matter what sort of success we have within Iraq, those insurgents perhaps can always just wait on the other side of the border, no matter when we withdraw. In my opinion, the only way to solve this nettlesome problem is if we get to the point where we have confidence in the Iraqi government's ability to maintain order. If we get to the point where we think the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police can maintain order and can deal with insurgents, then it'll be okay to communicate a time of exit. The costs issue aside. This is not unrelated to President Nixon's policy of Vietnamization. When he said, as we're going to withdraw American troops from South Vietnam, and then South Vietnamese forces are going to take their place. And then the big debate in Washington is, how well is this going in Iraq? How well are Iraqi security forces doing? Are they getting better? Are there more of them? And then at what point can we say, Iraq can now stand on its own, and so we can withdraw knowing that once we leave, Iraqi security forces can take over?
And, or having democracy. And I think the answer think that the surge only played a role in the improving of the situation in Iraq. And one of the other things is that I think we must focus on the question.
I tell you what, let me stop you there because there are like 5 very good points, and let me sort of treat with the points you made so far because they're all very important. My comparison to Pakistan and the first point was that Iraq does not want to be like Pakistan or Lebanon or perhaps Norway either. And really, this was just a way for me to talk about what kind of Iraq we're satisfied with. One which is highly democratic, unstable, brink of civil war. It's a poor, blame me, it's a poor choice of words, but it does not evade the central question of, how much do we want to get done in Iraq? I mean, do we want to get to the point where Iraq is completely democratic, highly prosperous, completely rebuilt, free elections and so forth, or something less than that? I'm not going to tell you what to do, but all I'm saying to you is that's a choice that everyone has to make as to what you want to have happen. Now, the second point I thought was extremely important, which is, especially as an Iraqi, this gentleman made the point that America has the moral obligation to spread democracy around the world and a moral obligation to build freedom in the Middle East. Now, that is a personal choice. I will not tell you, what to think about that. But I will make 2 points. One is that America makes choices. We allow genocide to happen. I mean, you only need to think about the Sudan to understand this. There was a genocide in Central Africa in the mid-1990s in which 500,000 African civilians were killed. Now, I had the great pleasure of having lunch with President Jimmy Carter in the late 1990s, and I asked him, I said, President Carter, we're getting involved in Bosnia now, where about 10,000 or 20,000 civilians are at risk, but we did not get involved in Rwanda in the mid-1990s when some 500,000 civilians were at risk. Why is that? And he said, well, that's just racism, that Americans are not willing to, sacrifice blood and money for Africans, but they are for Europeans. So the reality of it is, and I'm not judging it, I'm just saying the reality of it is, we choose to protect civilians and advance democracy in some places and not others. The other point I want to make to you is, we certainly would all agree that democracy is a good thing. We would like to see more democracy, and genocide and violence against civilians is a bad thing. But the question that we have to ask is, what kind of costs are we willing to spend? Now, it's perfectly reasonable for you to say, I'm willing to spend a lot of costs. I'm willing to spend $100 billion a year. I'm willing to, sacrifice 500 Americans per year. I'm willing to do that, which is fine. But the things you have to remember is that those are costs, and that money in particular is coming at the expense of other things which we care about, even other national security things which we care about. Okay? And so, yes, it's a moral obligation, but it's not an absolute moral duty. I mean, it has to come in relationship to everything else. Now, he also made some points about the importance of the surge and so forth, that other factors played a role. He said that the Iranian threat is pushing Sunnis forward. I think that's a very true point. I also think that Al-Qaeda in general overplayed its hand, and there was a backlash against it. Very true. But that may be reason for hope as to why it might be an opening for withdrawal. If we're getting to the point now where Sunnis have finally recognized that they need to swallow their pride and get along with the Shia and the Kurds, then that's great. If the security situation is improving because the Sunnis are cooperating with security forces, that's great. And one could say that's an opportunity for American withdrawal. Well, let me stop there and let some other people ask questions. Mm-hmm.
But is there a moral obligation on our part to address this problem, which
Mm-hmm.
is a consequence of the damage in the war,
Mm-hmm.
by and large?
Okay, a very good question. The woman said, do we have a moral obligation for the economic reconstruction of Iraq, especially the provision of public health, basic services, and so forth? I am not going to begin to answer the question as to whether or not we have a moral obligation. That is for you to decide. I mean, you might also say, what is the moral obligation to Iraqi citizens versus American citizens? Some might say we broke Saddam's regime. We owe it to the Iraqi people to rebuild their country. Others might say that there are many Americans who suffer without sufficient, health care and provision of basic services, and that $100 billion a year could be spent on them. I'm not going to take a position on that, but that's something to think about. I will say that an unfortunate reality is that we cannot throw money at this problem and hope for a solution. Or I should say more precisely, we have thrown money at the problem, and we know that it's not sufficient. For example, this government report I talked about in my presentation found that the Iraqi government has a budget for capital projects, building roads, schools, hospitals, things like this. And it found that for the 2007 annual budget, by the middle of 2007, by June, they'd only spent 4.4% of their allotted monies. Okay? So you'd think by the middle of the year, they might have spent 50% of their allotted monies. So like almost all foreign aid endeavors, it's very, very difficult to do. There's tremendous corruption on both the American and the Iraqi side. The insurgents fight against capital projects, so solving the political instability is almost a precursor to solving the economic problems and so forth. So, we would like to think that this is a chance for American charity to work. You'd like to say, if we can just, everybody chip in like $10 an American per year. Could you give $10 and we could really solve the problem? Right? We're all charitable, right? We'd do that. We'd give $10 a year to solve Iraqi society. But the problem is, it's not that simple. And that foreign aid and reconstruction is very, very difficult. And in Iraq, we are going to have to solve the security problem and the political problems before we can really solve the economic problems.
If the major oil region is in complete
Great. Thank you very much. All very good points. I'm going to have to repeat each point for the videotape. The first question was sort of getting at the regional effects, concerned about the possibility of the domino effects of a collapse in Iraq, and also mentioning the Biden proposal for loose federalism and some way of sharing oil. We're very much concerned with the regional effects. But whether or not, I think people who advocate rapid withdrawal and people who advocate slower withdrawal each have arguments as to why, the region we better stabilize with what they propose. I mean, people who advocate more rapid withdrawal say that American forces in the region are, exacerbating anti-Americanism and they're making Iran stronger, and so on and so forth. And people on the other side say that if Iraq were to collapse, then it would have these disastrous effects. So I don't think there are any easy answers to that issue. I don't pretend to have any myself. The Biden proposal of loose federalism, it's a good idea, but it kind of leaves very large questions begged. Yes, they have to, anybody, whether you're Biden or anybody else, has to figure out a way to divide the oil. You have to figure out some kind of solution by which the oil, which is principally under the Shia South and the Kurdish North, some of that money goes to the Sunnis. And the problem is that we can't tell them how to do it. They have to figure it out themselves. And of course, the Kurds and the Shia don't want to give that oil money up, and the Sunnis want them to give it up. So we can talk about proposals and this and that, but it's something which the factions within Iraq have to agree on. Similarly, they have to agree on what kind of loose federal structure they want. They have to decide whether or not they want a stronger centralized government or a looser government. They have to decide if they want a truly national army or whether they want to have regional militias. And so that begs the question, how can we facilitate that process? And people who are more pro-withdrawal, faster withdrawal, say, if we withdraw our troops faster, that's going to encourage the factions to cut these deals more quickly. And then people on the other side say, we have to stay longer in order to ensure stability, because you have to have a longer time period in order for them to solve these problems. And the fact that they just passed this law allowing Baathists back into the government, that's evidence that the American presence is working. Now, the second question you asked was, can't we have some kind of Marshall Plan for the Middle East? And, I would say that we already do. We already are dumping gigantic amounts of economic aid, us and other members of the international community, into Egypt, Pakistan, Iraq, and the Palestinian Authority. And the problem is that money is not being spent efficiently, as I discussed in this other woman's question. There's tremendous corruption and other kinds of problems. Unfortunately, it's not kind of a magic wand kind of a problem where you can just throw money at it and wave your magic wand and make Iraq look like Norway, as it were. The other aspect of the Marshall Plan is, how much more money would you want to spend, and at what expense? If you are going to spend an extra $50 billion a year on economic aid for the Middle East, then, what does that come at the expense of? Does that mean that we're going to have an extra $50 billion in taxes? Does it mean $50 billion in cuts on domestic spending? Does it mean the federal deficit goes up from $250 to $300 billion per year? I think those questions would have to be answered. And the third point, also a very good one, is what about potential alliances? Can't we draw other countries in? And it is very good news that China and to some degree Russia are helping us solve the North Korea problem and helping us solve the Iran problem. And I'm very pleased to see that the Bush administration is much more engaged in diplomacy in its last year or so in office. President Bush, of course, just toured the Middle East, which is great. The problem is that none of those countries are going to send troops to Iraq, I don't think. I don't think China is going to send peacekeepers to Iraq. I don't think the Russians are going to send peacekeepers to Iraq. And so, and Britain certainly isn't. The unfortunate reality is they may be able to help us do things like, manage the Iranian nuclear program and help us push forward, a peace settlement between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but they're not going to put boots on the ground in Iraq. So we have to think about that ourselves, unfortunately. Thank you. Let me, again, repeat those questions. The first question is, what about Afghanistan? And is this ignoring Afghanistan? And how can we fight a war on two fronts? And, this, to me, is probably the single greatest cost of the decision to fight in Iraq. We had the Taliban on the run in late 2002. The military campaign was going well. We had Osama bin Laden and Tora Bora. And in late 2002, critical military units were diverted from Afghanistan in preparation for the Iraqi campaign, which probably substantially contributed in a negative way to the poor Afghan military situation. That, to me, is probably the greatest tragedy of the Iraqi war. I think that is a very real cost of the continuing operation in Iraq. I mean, if you are a hawk and you think that we have to spend $100 billion and these lives on protecting American national security, you have to ask the question, are those troops and monies better spent in Iraq or in Afghanistan? That's something which concerns me very greatly. The second point is, when will America stop being the policeman of the world? And, this kind of gets back to the earlier question of, do we have a moral obligation to protect Iraq? And, it's an individual question. George W. Bush in 2000 did not want to be the policeman of the world. I mean, his campaign was very specific. He said, America should start withdrawing troops from Europe. America should not get involved in nation building. We should not be the policeman of the world, and so forth. And, some Americans feel the same way, that they're not willing to spend all this blood and money to try to solve the world's problems. And the only thing I would, suggest to you is that, that's a very individual decision. And, those decisions get made anyway. We did not intervene in Rwanda. We are not intervening in Darfur. We did intervene in Bosnia. We did intervene in Afghanistan. And we did intervene in Iraq. So we have to think very clearly about what we want to do. How much of a policeman do we want to be, if at all? Where are we going to intervene, and how much money and blood are we going to spend to accomplish these missions? And the unfortunate reality is that very few other countries are willing to do these jobs for us. The former Yugoslavia was a mess in the 1990s, in the early 90s, because Europe did not send substantial forces into Bosnia. It was only the American commitment in the mid-1990s which helped forge the peace settlement. In 1999, America engaged in a substantial aerial campaign against Serbia to prevent them from slaughtering Albanian Kosovars, and it was substantially American planes which engaged in those missions. The Europeans are not going to do it, the Russians are not going to do it, the Chinese are not going to do it, so, we cannot sort of pass the buck onto others.
Noticed that several times, both you yourself and the questioner used the phrase "declare victory and come home."
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if declaring victory is waving a red flag at people who are against us. Victory means you've won a war. Let's face it, when you've got an argument, there's usually right and wrong on both sides. And is there some way we could begin thinking more diplomatically about how to get rather than saying declare victory?
Great, thank you. The woman's point is I think she's uncomfortable with the idea of declaring victory and going home, that this is perhaps an example of would be an example of American arrogance or hubris, and that we should perhaps think about this more diplomatically. Well, this is how I think we should do it in Iraq. Once we decide when we want to withdraw troops, like let's just say we're going to withdraw troops at the end of 2010. I just pulled that out of the air. Okay. Then what we should do is we should go to the Iraqi government secretly and say, we want you to ask us to withdraw. Okay? And then the Iraqi president will say, we want American troops to withdraw. And then the president would say, whether it's President McCain or Clinton or Obama or Romney, would say, America has never intended to occupy Iraq. We've always been there as guests of the Iraqi government. We've always been there only at the behest of the Iraqi government. Now that we have been formally asked to leave, then we shall leave, knowing, as we in the Iraqi government do, that we have accomplished our mission of stabilizing Iraq. Now, it may be a bit of a fiction to say that we've actually stabilized Iraq or not, but nonetheless, American presidents always have to declare that. President Nixon has to declare in January of '73 that we've won. The Paris Peace Accords means that North Vietnam is no longer going to destabilize South Vietnam. We're declaring victory and going home. So that phrase is, what we use, what American presidents use when wars end. But I think your larger point is a very good one, which is that there are more diplomatic and more sensitive ways to do this than others, to which I heartily agree. Very good. The question is, does the Bush administration really want to leave Iraq? And the woman pointed out that we're building a very large embassy in Baghdad, and perhaps that our interests in Iraq are more driven by concerns about Iraq's oil wealth rather than building democracy. I think the Bush administration probably would like to have a enduring presence, American military and diplomatic presence in Iraq, and economic presence as well. I think that the Bush administration genuinely feels that American troops are part of the solution and not part of the problem, and that the presence of American troops is going to help stabilize Iraq, which will then hopefully accomplish both goals, the loftier goal of reducing violence in Iraq and the more mercenary goal of securing American access to Iraqi oil. Now, whether or not America is in this principally because of oil there, well, I think most people would agree that, absent oil in Iraq, if Iraq was a country completely without oil, then we'd be, much less interested in it. In 1990, then Secretary of State James Baker had a very good one-liner on this, where people said, why are we, interested in Iraq? Why are we going to liberate Kuwait? And he said, this is in 91, mind you, he said that if you were going to boil down the motivation to liberate Kuwait, it comes down to one word, and that word is jobs. So he was quite open about it. right? And at that point, we were not talking about transforming Kuwait into a democracy, mind you. We were just trying to, liberate Kuwait and restore the monarchy. So he was quite open about it, and I think most Americans and most people in the administration recognize that a big reason why we need to stabilize Iraq is to secure our access, or long-term access to Iraqi oil.
Mentioned was the cost of the various options and the cost of diplomacy for staying longer in Iraq. I wonder if you could address the cost of pulling out quickly and perhaps abandoning our allies or destabilizing the region.
Thank you. The question was, I mentioned the diplomatic costs of staying longer. Are there costs of leaving quickly? Of abandoning our allies. First of all, I think we need to remember that we shouldn't think of Iraq as an ally. We need to think of Iraq as an emerging country. It's not like France. It's not like they're a member of NATO. It's not like there's a treaty which we would break by withdrawing our troops. We wouldn't violate international law. Another question I would sort of encourage people to think about is, when is it enough? I mean, this war has now lasted longer than World War II. We've spent more money than was lost on the 9/11 attacks. We've lost more American lives than were lost in the 9/11 attacks. At some point, when is it enough? When is it enough? Should we have not abandoned South Vietnam when we had 56,000 American dead? Was that an abandonment? Should we have kept going? My other thought is that I don't really think there's going to be diplomatic costs of us abandoning an ally. That is, I don't think other countries are going to look at this and say, "Gosh, America's just cutting and running. They're no longer reliable." Where else are these countries going to go? Is Egypt going to and Saudi Arabia going to cut a deal with Iran because they think that America is no longer involved in Iraq? When we haven't cut, without our cutting financial or military aid to either of these countries? Is Israel going to decide that America is no longer a useful ally and they'll cut us loose and then deal with the Palestinians by themselves? I frankly don't think that there are going to be all that many costs of people thinking that we're weak. I think, conversely, if we do it in a way which is, as was mentioned earlier, in a multilateral fashion, we involve other countries in the region, we involve Iran, we involve Syria, we involve other countries, and we do it, in a way that we leave, Iraq not as a complete mess, I think that would probably enhance American credibility. That part of it, that really doesn't bother me that much. Because what would happen? If Saudi Arabia thinks we're no longer reliable, what would they do? They're reliant on us to buy their oil. They're reliant on us to offer them protection from Iran. They have nowhere else to go. Russia, they can't go to Russia. They can't go to China the way they have support from us. Great, thank you. First question is, has there ever been a formal declaration of war against Iraq? Okay, here's a trivia question. Does anybody know when was the last time America formally declared war against another country? 1941. That's right. There was no formal... The U.S. Constitution allows the U.S. Congress the right to formally declare war, and not the president. There was no declaration of war in Korea, Vietnam, the first Gulf War, Afghanistan, or the Iraq War. Now, that being said, obviously, wars are fought without a formal declaration of war. During the Korean War, President Truman kind of inartfully called it a police action. And in other wars, the president has secured resolutions which allow him to essentially fight a war without a formal congressional declaration. So in 1964, President Johnson got the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed by the Congress, which gave him a free hand to fight. And in 1990, the Senate passed a resolution giving the president a very free hand to fight against Iraq then, and so forth. Now, the other question is, at the end of the day, is the president's prerogative to decide when it's over? And that is actually a more complicated question than it sounds. And there's a debate amongst politicians and legal scholars as to how much authority the president should have. Because some people say, well, the Constitution gives, foreign policy authority to the president. The president's the commander-in-chief. So the president gets to say, when it starts and when it stops. Now, there are many in Congress who disagree with that, and they say, we're willing to give the president a tremendous amount of leeway, but enough is enough. And this was seen most specifically last year when Democrats in the Congress tried through legislative machinations to cut funding for the Iraq War. Well, they said, well, you're the commander-in-chief, but the Congress controls the budget. And so we're going to try to, backdoor our way into curtailing the war effort by substantially cutting funding for the war unless you agree to a troop withdrawal. So on that question, I'm afraid I have to give you a rather messy answer, to which constitutional scholars give different answers, and then, people have different preferences. And the way people think about it is, how you answer that question affects what's going to happen for future presidents. And so the irony is that, even though, people said last year, Hillary Clinton may be very much opposed to the Bush administration aggregating so much executive authority for itself in terms of, torture and carrying out the war in Iraq and so forth. But all of that power she would inherit if she, enters the White House in January of 2009. So how you answer that question, it has longer implications for the American constitutional order beyond just what's happening in Iraq.
I'm an old political warhead, of course, from way back, and I was against this war from the very beginning. But that aside, you keep asking, we have to make up our own minds, and I see it as a way of those of us who are opposed fighting like the Dickens to get candidates from the bottom clear up to the top to push back what we've had these last 8 years, 7.5 years. And then we will be able to move the government just a little bit. Is that not a plausible idea of just being able to get back to diplomacy where a phone can be picked up and call Iran instead of bombastically telling you to go to heck and back?
I very much agree. I mean, no matter where you fall on the spectrum, there's probably a presidential candidate with whom you are sympathetic with. I mean, if you are a libertarian who is very much opposed to the U.S. being the policeman of the world, then Ron Paul is probably your candidate. If you are a hawk who wants to see this war, fought effectively, and we're not going to cut and run, and we're going to stick it out, then McCain or perhaps Romney are probably your candidates. If you think that we need to cut short this war sooner rather than later because of the high cost of the war and because that'll probably help us fight, end the war more quickly, then, Senator Obama or Senator Clinton or Senator Edwards are probably your candidates. And yeah, I agree completely. And what happens in November of 2008, and also what happens in the caucuses along the way, you all have a very big decision to make, and it's very clear that in January of 2009, this country can go in a variety of directions on Iraq and other things as well. And it's the candidates are very clearly distinguishing them from each other, especially the Democrats from the Republicans. It's not like 2000 where there was a lot of convergence on many issues between Gore and Bush. It's more like 2004 where Kerry and Bush were very different on policy issues, and the Democrats and Republicans are very, very different now. And so I think it's up to everybody, whether like yourself you're opposed to this war, or if you're on the other side and you support the war and you want to see this thing fought to the finish, then it's incumbent upon you to identify the candidate that you like his or her positions, support them, if not give money or work for them, then cast your ballot in November, if not in the Georgia caucuses. Remember that we're taught that by it seems so terribly and is relatively